Our speaker is Andy Brown. He's from Newham SWP branch, and he'll be introducing the topic Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. Is there anything left of the pink tide? So Andy will talk for around 25 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussions afterwards.
Thank you. Right. Well, let's start with the basics. The pink tide is not a very well-known term in Europe. It's very commonly used in Latin America. In fact, the chair's just said that she had to Google it to find out what the meeting was about. So let's start with that. The pink tide is the tendency for Latin American populations to elect left or left-leaning governments in the time frame roughly 1998 to 2009. And in most of the continent, at some point in that time frame, there was elected a left or left-leaning government. I'll talk about that in a second. Sometimes for quite an extended period of time, the most obvious being Venezuela. Yeah? And it meant two things really, the pink tide, two sort of political sentiments I suppose. And the first is the break with the Washington Consensus, the idea of a revolt against the demands of neoliberalism, against free market capitalism, about the economic domination of the continent by North America especially, but by imperialism in general. And the second thing it meant was the idea of national sovereignty, and this is kind of encapsulated in the use of the word Bolivarian, which is again, you know, a term that was kind of new to us a decade ago. The idea that Latin American countries, the destiny of them and the economies of them should be controlled by the governments and the people of Latin America rather than by imperialist interests. And it was very significant across Latin America. You know, one example followed another. Now there are problems of definition here. How left does a government have to be considered part of the pink tide? And you can do this all day long really to figure out who's who. But generally speaking, the governments that are thought of by all commentators as part of the pink tide are Bolivia, Venezuela and Ecuador, which we're going to focus on. Also Brazil under the Workers' Party, Lula and then Rousseff. And also Argentina under Kirchner and then Fernandez de Kirchner, who's just left office last December. There are others as well, like Uruguay, Paraguay and later on Peru also generally sneak into the category. El Salvador and Nicaragua have at some point in that period been ruled by governments whose roots were in the guerrilla movement of the 20th century, and therefore they generally get a mention in the pink tide. And then there's Chile, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Mexico sometimes, which are included. Panama and Colombia definitely weren't included. No one knows what goes on in Suriname or Belize. Who did I leave out? I mean, you can spend all day doing this. And the truth is that some of the governments that describe
Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao.
Yeah, Curaçao's difficult, isn't it? Yeah. I met the education minister of Curaçao once. That was strange. You completely lost my train now. The point is that some of these governments have at best been mildly social democratic, and frankly, some of them have simply been austerity or neoliberalism light. So I'm not going to focus on all of them or try and take them in. Obviously, to do that would just require a meeting that was 3 hours long. So we're going to talk about three particular countries for two reasons, really: Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And one of the reasons is that I think that the changes made in those three countries are of a greater degree than in many of the others. So they did more in terms of reform, if you like. And the other, which is less important to mainstream commentators but very important to us, is the level of mobilisation among the working class and the poor that brought the governments to power. Now, if one of your criteria for considering what represents socialism and the project of socialism in the 21st century is that the liberation of the working class and the progress for the working class is the act of the working class itself, it's very important that we point out the level of popular mobilisation which came, if you like, before and gave rise to the pink tide government. So briefly on the three countries. First of all, Venezuela. The turning point for Venezuela was not necessarily or not particularly Chavez. Rather, it's kind of the date of the process, the Proceso Bolivariano, the Venezuelan process, goes back to 1989 in the Caracas. Caracas was an uprising in Caracas and in most of the major towns of Venezuela, and it was provoked by the imposition of IMF structural adjustment programs on Venezuela, in particular a hike in the price of fuel, both petrol and heating and cooking fuel. And there was an enormous insurrection right across the cities. Thousands of dead. There was a massive confrontation between the working class and the poor and the authorities of the two governments in Venezuela that used to switch power between the two of them. There were two capitalist parties, ADN and COPEI, and essentially they operated what somebody called a two-party, one-party state, where they would change positions in office, but in fact there would be no change in the sense of the domination of capitalist interests in Venezuela. What the Caracas did was put that whole system within doubt, and it induced Chavez, who clearly identified himself in a tradition of Latin American military reformers from Torrijos in Panama and Velasco Ibarra in Peru and so on. This is where he located himself. But the political context of the Caracas and the uprising by the poor induced him first to attempt a coup which failed, in which he was put in prison briefly, but later essentially drove the election of Chavez in 1998 and the whole process of the Bolivarian revolution, or what they call in Venezuela the Bolivarian process, that went on until Chavez's death in 2013. Similarly, Bolivia, slightly later, from about 2000, there was a process of mass confrontation involving millions of people, between neoliberal governments and working class organisations, the urban poor, the peasant organisations and so on. So between beginning with the water war in Cochabamba, which was 2000, was a confrontation over the privatisation of water supply, in which the whole city and the region around Cochabamba was held effectively for long periods by demonstrators who occupied the centre of town, mass strikes, there were enormous blockades, etc. on the roads and so on, and did result in the control being taken back of the water from Bechtel, the multinational who was trying to privatise it. It was followed by mass revolts against neoliberal presidents. In 2003, a president was deposed. In 2005, a president was deposed. And in that process, to cut a very long and very exciting, by the way, very exciting story short, you saw a process in which the major towns in Bolivia were in the hands of demonstrators, where the police mutinied and fought the army, where in the Altiplano, the high Andes, the peasants cut all communication, all effective road communication in Bolivia for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, where the urban poor were involved in insurrections against the government. There's amazing stories of how they pushed a railway carriage and a railway train over an embankment to block the Bolivian army's tanks going through El Alto and stuff like that. It was an absolutely massive confrontation involving millions and millions of people. The FSTMB, the Mine Workers Union, announced that every member of the Mine Workers Union in Bolivia would march on La Paz. The cocaleros, the coca growers, very influential in Cochabamba and that area, the Yungas, joined the demonstration. So you're talking about an enormous mass movement. Now, Ecuador is rather less known about, but it's very difficult to find good stuff to read on Ecuador in English. But at the same time, about the beginning of the century, there was a series of mass mobilisations with the same tactics: roadblocks, strikes, demonstrations. The Ecuadorian parliament was taken over by the indigenous organisations for a period of days, etc., in which two presidents were driven from office and a third was trounced in an election. And what you've got in all three countries really is exactly what Trotsky described when he talked about what a revolution looked like. This is what he said: "The most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct intervention of the masses in historic events. In ordinary times, the state, whether it's monarchical or democratic, elevates itself above the nation, and history is made by specialists in that line of business: kings, ministers, bureaucrats, parliamentarians, journalists. But at those crucial moments when the old order becomes no longer endurable to the masses, they flood over the barriers, excluding them from the political arena. They sweep aside their traditional representatives, and they create by their own intervention the initial groundwork for a new regime. And that's exactly what happened in those three countries, and in other parts of Latin America as well. But that fantastic description of sweeping over the barriers that normally exclude working people from the political process is exactly what we've got. Now, the left governments of Chavez in Venezuela, of Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Rafael Correa in Ecuador were not the embodiment of that process, but certainly a reflection of it. The election of those leaders followed the mass movements. And what they showed really is a powerful rejection of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus, a refusal to accept the demands and priorities of the market, and a refusal to accept the domination of their countries by multinational North American capital especially. A little on the reforms, because the reforms I think are important. Correa came to power in Ecuador. Let's start with Ecuador. Correa came to power demanding what he called a citizens' revolution and, quote, the radical and rapid changes in existing structure of society, as he put it. He focused on corruption, on debt, and on a refusal, or rather a refocusing of national resources away from debt repayment towards social programs. So if you look at what was done in between 2006 and 2013 in Ecuador, for example, the major priorities: housing, health, education, and so on. So the health budget tripled in that period, from 560 to 1770 million per year. Mobile hospitals were set up. There was a scheme for producing medicines at low cost and underneath the market values, etc., so the poor could have access to them. The education budget, as I say, tripled again. Things like free school lunches for kids in Ecuadorian schools, free school uniforms, because kids have to pay for their uniform and so on. A new labour law banned subcontracting and effectively raised the minimum wage. Correa sort of famously said that, you know, when you raise the minimum wage by a few dollars, everybody denounces you in the national and the international press as a demagogue and a populist, and yet when the banks charge anything between 26 and 45% interest, no one bats an eyelid. So an indication of this kind of how the priorities in government were shifting away from the interests of big capital and towards the interest of the poor. Ecuador joined Cuba and Nicaragua as illiteracy free in that period as well, and 900 million was spent on public housing in Ecuador. Oh, as an aside, I should mention as well that the kind of unorthodox tactics of Correa and Chavez, which I'll come back to Chavez in a minute, but I'll give you a little example of Correa. When he was denounced by a particularly reactionary political opponent in the Ecuadorian parliament, he came out with the immortal words, "Back in the day in my barrio, we had ways of dealing with people like you," and challenged him to a fist fight. Now, I'm not advocating this form of macho nonsense as a useful political method, but I, for one, would pay good money to see 12 rounds between Dennis Skinner and Michael Gove. Chavez reforms are much better known I'm sure a lot of people in the room know about Chavez reforms. Again, very similar emphasis: housing, health, access to education, especially for the working class from which they've been excluded. So there are a series of what were called misiones, the missions, funded by oil income, which vastly expanded the access of ordinary people to health services, to both secondary and higher education, and to decent housing. Interestingly, an IMF report, of all people, the IMF report said that Venezuela is the only country in the world that's become more equal over the last 20 years, which shows, you know, there is a major difference. There was some land reform, there was a drive to ensure better terms of trade for the country's primary products on the world market, and generally a reorientation of government spending towards the benefit of the poor. Other things, all three governments kind of acknowledge the plurinational nature of their states. That's to say, they look much more favourably on indigenous people and indeed black people in Venezuela and Ecuador in particular. The superbly named Ecuadorian Vice President, Lenin Voltaire Moreno Garces, yeah, I'd vote for him as well, has become kind of quite a champion in Latin America for disabled people. There have been some moves towards constitutional arrangements, what they call popular assemblies or constituent assemblies, that I think they're very limited, but nonetheless they're orientated on giving more political participation for sectors that have previously been marginalised from the political process. In foreign affairs as well, there was a considerable and articulate resistance to North American imperialism, both in Latin America itself, but also across the world. Chavez especially was well known for attacking North American interventions in the Middle East, for example, defending Hezbollah against the Israeli invasion when the world press was denouncing Hezbollah and siding, as always, with imperialism in the Middle East. Chavez was described as the voice of the Arab masses when he was speaking out against the American interventions. He famously followed George Bush onto the podium at the United Nations General Assembly, the UN General Assembly in New York, and when he got to the platform, took hold of the dais and said, likened him to the devil and said he could still smell the sulphur. Correa, by the way, distanced himself from that remark because he said he felt it was unfair on the devil. Now, there isn't any doubt at all that these three governments that we're talking about have introduced a range of reforms that's benefited the poor. They've challenged the neoliberal model and they've reduced inequality. Even The Economist, actually, there's this gut-wrenchingly smug article in December last year after the Argentinian elections went to the right. But The Economist interestingly said this: South America is not about to go back to the past. The left put inequality on the region's agenda and it's there to stay. Now, I'll come back to that a bit at the end, but there's no doubt that every socialist should defend these movements, these measures unconditionally and argue against the attacks of the right. This is not very complicated. The attacks on the pink tide regimes have come from, first and foremost, the capitalists in Latin America, the rich and powerful in Latin America who want to continue to exploit their own populations and ensure that the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. They've also come from North America, from the other imperial powers and their servants in the international press who regard the only way possible as a neoliberal model, which means that imperialism dominates the world. And they've come, as I say, from the international press in particular. You'll have seen they've made a big deal about press freedom, etc. in Venezuela, in Ecuador and in Bolivia. And the truth is, as Correa says, when you try and get a large media company in Ecuador to pay its taxes, they say it's an attack on the freedom of expression. So let's not get too much into worrying about the interests of big media bosses in Venezuela and in Ecuador. These people are firmly aligned with the right and with imperialism, and all socialists can easily triangulate their own position when you look at the US State Department, the Washington Post, Repsol and El País in Spain and so on. There's no question which side we're on, and there's no question that we acknowledge the progress and we defend the conduct of those governments. However, having said that, we are not cheerleaders for this or that reformist process, and that's what these have been. They are specifically reformist processes in Latin America. There have been very strict limits on the level of change, particularly structural change. Jeff Webber, interestingly, who's a very good writer, by the way, Canadian I think, is a very good writer on Bolivia, actually describes the mass government in Bolivia, one of the more left ones actually, as reconstituted neoliberalism. So it kind of underlines how tight really how restricted the changes have been. The bounds of the market and the demands of capital accumulation have not been set aside. The capitalist state has not been, in some cases, not been challenged, but certainly not been replaced. Workers' movements and social movements in all these countries have faced opposition from these governments at times, and at times state violence has been used against them. In Bolivia, for example, against indigenous movements defending their land rights, and in Ecuador the same. In Venezuela even, there have been conflicts with working class organisations at a local level and even at a national level where the state has fronted down the independent trade unions in Venezuela. Power has not been taken from the hands of capital and transferred to the hands of labour. The mobilisation and self-organisation of the working class and the social movements in these countries has not been a priority for the governments of the pink tide. At times they've used, certainly, mobilisation, in particularly at election time, but they have not made it a priority, and they've always had to operate within the restrictions imposed by the state. Similarly, on international arrangements, yes, there have been significant regional, organisations, ALBA and so on, trading organisations. There's been serious opposition to the free trade area of the Americas and to imperialism. But the diversification of, say, investment and trade, does not mean that this is an internationalist movement of peoples. When you get investment from Belarus, from Iran, from Russia, from China in particular, which is massive in all three of the countries we're discussing, this is on the basis of relations between capitalist states. China is in Latin America because it's looking for what you'd expect an imperialist power to look for. Cheap labour, cheap resources, a source of profit and so on. So we're not the cheerleaders for these people, and we're not the starry-eyed kind of apologists that there have been on the left, both in North America and in Europe. Rather, it's that crucial balance between absolute and unconditional support for the movements when they serve the interests of the working class. But at the same time, we are not uncritical of the process that's gone on in Latin America. Now, to return to the question in the title of the meeting now, of course the pink tide is now in crisis, and how much is left? Is there still, can we still seriously think about a progressive movement in Latin America is one of the questions that commentators are asking. Now for some, this is just an excuse to bash the left. Let's Nick Cohen from Take a Bow, all he wants to do is bash the left, say capitalism and neoliberalism is the only way and there is no alternative to the system. But there isn't any doubt that the limits of reform are being shown up in the light of two things, I think. First, the question of the price of commodities on the world market, especially the price of oil, of which more in a second. But also, the limits of the process are being shown by the relationship between the pink tide governments and the working class in their countries. So, to briefly summarise where we are at the moment, in Argentina, the candidate of centre-left, who was supposed to replace Cristina Fernandez in the December elections, was defeated by Macri, who's a fairly sort of traditional neoliberal politician. In Brazil, as you know, the parties that used to be part of the coalition around the Workers' Party in the Congress, and there were 26 of them, by the way. There's a very good article in International Socialism Journal at the moment, and there's a table, a mesmerising table with 26 different parties listed, and they're changing positions between the Lula government, the Rousseff government, and whether they're in favour of impeachment. But what's effectively happened in Brazil is a coup inside the Brazilian parliament against Dilma Rousseff. It has no judicial basis at all, by the way, but it's a political coup to try and ship out Rousseff and weaken, if not remove, the Workers' Party government. In Bolivia and Ecuador, both governments have suffered sort of electoral reverses in constitutional referenda on proposed changes to arrangements for governance. Most importantly for us, the situation in Venezuela, where in Venezuela last December, the right-wing MUD, it's called, the Democratic Round Table, misnamed Democratic Round Table, took 112 of 167 seats in the Venezuelan National Assembly, which is a 2/3 majority, giving them considerable power against the Maduro government. The PSUV vote, the Chavista party vote, fell to 36% in the December elections, which with Chavez it was somewhere between 53 and 63%. So clearly what's happening in Venezuela is some people are no longer mobilising and voting for Chavez, some people have switched sides, but the fact that it's dropped from the mid-60s to the mid-30s is a very considerable indicator of the setbacks that the pink tide governments are suffering. So I'm going to focus a little bit on Venezuela really, which is the thing that I guess most people have seen most about, and what's gone wrong in Venezuela. The first thing to say is that the right wing in Venezuela, and we've said this at several different meetings annually at Marxism, was always highly mobilised, well funded from abroad, both from government and from private institutions and from Venezuelan capitalists abroad. It's always been absolutely militantly fighting for its class interests, with no regard whatever for constitutional practice or democracy. That has not changed. That's been like that for the last 15 years, well, throughout the whole process in Venezuela. It never changed. What has changed is the relationship between the PSUV, the Bolivarian leadership, if you like, and the working class, I think. And what you've got in Venezuela is a new type of state that was promised has not emerged. So the idea that popular power could be built, and indeed it looked like it was being built in that process in 2002. Have you seen The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, where mass mobilisation defends Chavez against the coup, where they broke the bosses' strike in the oil industry, where they drove off attempts to impeach Chavez and so on, by mass mobilisation. But the fact is that the PSUV set up by Chavez did not become a mass democratic organisation in which the rank and file and which working class of the country were able to participate meaningfully in government. Rather, it became a transmission belt from top to bottom, from government to population, where the instructions of government were carried out, maybe not carried out, where mobilisation was strictly confined to electoral processes. Chavez himself, in the last proclamation he made really, said this very clearly. It was called the Plan para la Patria in 2013, just before he died, a kind of national development plan. And he said, we should not delude ourselves. The socio-economic form which prevails in Venezuela remains capitalist. For new forms of planning and production for the benefit of people to emerge requires pulverising the bourgeois form of the state, which is still reproducing itself through abominable old practices. And that's exactly what happened. In Venezuela, people refer to it as the Boliburguesia, which means the Bolivarian bourgeoisie. And the fact is that a new ruling class has emerged through the PSUV and the state machine, which carries on with the traditional practices of 20th century Venezuela, enriching itself, rife with corruption, full of nepotism. One example, the wife of President Maduro has managed to place 65 members of her family in leading positions in either the National Assembly or PDVSA, the oil company. I don't even know 65 members of the family. 65 members of the family, thank God. 65 members of the family who've been put into positions. And when people see this, it's unsurprising that they've become alienated from the Chavista political process. While the oil price remained high, it was possible to sustain the reform programme and to include, to carry on the misiones, for example, and indeed to promote the sort of intercontinental, the intracontinental rather, aid, as it effectively was, to countries like Nicaragua and Bolivia through subsidised oil, what Michael Roberts calls petrodiplomacy, which Venezuela did. That's not possible with oil prices around, it was now $40 a barrel, but they dropped as low as $32 a barrel. At the time of Chavez, they were $140 a barrel. Venezuela relies on oil for 95% of its export earnings. So that project is no longer sustainable economically. The diversification of industry that was promised was never forthcoming. The development of agriculture to reduce dependence on imported food was never forthcoming. Is there a way out? Michael Roberts on his blog, in a piece entitled "Venezuela Waiting for the End," which kind of tells you the answer before he's done the reasoning. He says that what will be needed in a moment is a massive level of state intervention. Right? He talks about the need for the state monopoly of foreign trade, the expropriation of food production and distribution, default on foreign debt, expropriation of the banks, and a national plan for production. And he also stresses that even that would be insufficient unless there were other Latin American governments doing the same thing. Now the truth is, if any of that were to take place, it would go way, way beyond the parameters of the Chavez, the PSUV project that's gone so far. And to do it would require a political mobilisation, a return, if you like, to the days of mass street and industrial mobilisation from a decade ago. It would require a complete change in relationship between the PSUV leadership and party apparatus and the rank and file and the poor in the country. I don't think that's about to happen, I'll be frank with you. If it did, it would be a completely difficult process that we're talking about. But if it doesn't happen, the Venezuelan government is in very serious trouble. We can discuss that a little more if you want to. And because I'm running out of time, the economic situation in Venezuela is worse than in other countries. the pink tide countries, because of its utter dependence on oil. It's somewhat different in other countries, and because of the strength of the right. The right in Ecuador, for example, or certainly in Bolivia, is not as strong as it is in Venezuela. But nonetheless, those pressures on working class living standards, on health, education and housing, the resources available, do exist in the other countries, and the social tensions between the pink tide governments and the workers of those countries will continue. Right, to finish, I think there are three important legacies of the pink tide. The first is in Latin America. It will be very hard for the right, although they will try, to take away all those reforms that are put in place. Once you have had the changes that health, housing and education that there have been, that I've described briefly earlier on, people will not want to give those up, and it will be a motivating factor and can be used to mobilise to defend against the right-wing backlash and to defend against the increasing attacks on powers, without a doubt. Secondly, the legacy, you can see the legacy of these movements in Europe, especially in southern Europe. If you look at Podemos, for example, every leader of, or every senior leader of Podemos has been in, most of them have actually been in Latin America for quite a long time, some of them, and they're all heavily influenced by it. So you can see the influence of the pink tide, especially in the south of Europe, but in reformist projects, Syriza, Podemos and others as well. And although there are very strict limits to it, although it will come up against the limits of the capitalist state, what do you do about it? Exactly the question Syriza couldn't answer, and Podemos is increasingly avoiding having to answer. These questions will come up for sure, but nonetheless, the pink tide has injected a kind of inspiration into the anti-austerity movement, not just in the Americas, but also worldwide. The third and the most important legacy is this, and it's not to do with either the reform programs or the governments that put them there. It's to do with the level of mobilization that went on. What was gained in the pink tide in Latin America was fought for and won by mass mobilization. And that memory, that experience, that popular participation in that cannot be taken away, cannot be kind of stripped from the historical memory of working class people in Latin America, and therefore it can still be used as a kind of driving force of the popular movement there. This is a guy called Freddy Lamachi, who's an activist in El Alto in La Paz, the massive shanty town that surrounds La Paz. And this is what he says. Demands for democracy and the defence of national resources wrote an important page in the history of Bolivia, and in the heart and memory of every Bolivian. Above all, because everyone from now on will have in his or her memory that glorious scene of men and women fighting for their rights and their future, an event which they will recount to their descendants and which will allow real democracy to be built.
I just want to ask a question. Why don't you mention Maduro? I mean, he's in a horrible situation, but I live in Colombia, I lived in Colombia for 30 years, and I feel very emotional about the situation there. Yeah. And the fact that he wasn't mentioned, I just want to say that he's absolutely a fantastic guy, and he's done his best, and he's got the worst situation possible. I just want to make acknowledgement to Maduro.
Cool.
Just to say, if when comrades contribute, if they could face the audience, I think it's because we don't have mics, it's a little hard to hear. So, okay. Yeah.
I'm Paul from Germany. I want to raise a very more structural question. You just mentioned, but you didn't really talk about it. And this is about the whole economic structure in Latin America and in the third world in general. I think it's the problem, what they used to, André Gunder Frank and others used to call underdevelopment there, underdevelopment of industries. And I think all these governments, they haven't really tackled this problem. Because of the high commodity prices, they had the chance with the oil and other commodities to raise the income of the state and to make important reforms, which you mentioned, but they didn't manage to develop industrial structures. I would say I think it's necessary in Latin America and other countries to create a new industrialization. However, this could look like, this should be a point of discussion. Chavez talks about, in German we say endogene Entwicklung, endogen development, and regional cooperation with the ALBA and stuff, but I think there hasn't really come much out of this. And I think the discussion should now, and one problem, it's more about Brazil and Argentina, I think it's about the evils of extractivism, which is one of the major strategies. In Venezuela it's extractivism with the oil, and in Bolivia it's the gas, I think, and Ecuador as well. So this is not the way to get a sustainable, just development. The question is, are there anything we can remember about this strategy of import substitution in the 30s and whatever, how you can develop a kind of industry in these countries? So I would be interested to hear what you think about it.
Okay.
Hello, Duncan Smith from Chesterfield. I'm just interested to know what the state of the military is in South America and these countries, insofar as is there any way that they can pacify them, or are they getting their funding? Because they always appear to get whatever money they want, and they brutalise whatever government against them. I just really wanted to know what in terms of the strengths and the allegiances, and whether there is any way that you could actually turn a military in favour of leftists, because traditionally in South America they have always been very brutal, and they've always been putting down, especially in Paraguay and places like that.
Well, there are a lot of things to say in 3 minutes, but the most important thing is we need to be very critical with those movements from the left, of course. No? And one point is corruption, because corruption is mining the base of those movements. I've seen it. I'm in contact with people from Ecuador and Latin Americans in London and in Ecuador as well. And I remember people getting up very early in the morning at 5 to have everything organized, and they have time to be with Correa, when he came to London, and very supporting the movement at the beginning. And every time they saw cases of corruption with the Rafael Correa brother, Rafael Correa, cousin, etc., they themselves become demoralized. So I think, we need to. Andy was very, very critical, and he said about that Maduro, that case of 65 members of his family, but it is very important. I think we should have, those countries, they should have an anti-corruption minister, and because it's really, really important, because the mass media is in the hands on the right in those countries, and everybody knows. And USA have a lot of power, so they need to be almost perfect from the very first stage, because mining the base is very important. Well, another thing is that they need to diversize the economy, because, you talk about it, but Venezuela is a tropical country. They can raise a lot of products, and you didn't say that they were importing products from USA, agriculture and food products from USA. So they didn't use that the money they had from the petrol and in Ecuador from the money they were sending the immigrants, and they could diversify the economy and develop agriculture, develop tourism. Tourism is very important. So another example, instead of investing in education, which is very important, because I've been living there in Ecuador for some months, and I've seen how which priorities they have. People have priorities. Instead of investing in education, they invest in a big San Pedro, in the different the city just beside the city of my wife. So And they invest a lot of money in parties, you know, instead of investing in education. I mean the people, I'm not talking about the government, but the government invested in an elite, you know, university. They said, of course we have the right to have the best university in the world. But instead of investing in base education, they invested in the best, well, they wanted to have the best university in the world, with the best technology, paying the high wages to the best teachers in the world. So is that revolutionary, citizen revolutionary? We have to be very more critical, and of course I understand what you're saying, I agree almost with everything.
I've just got a couple of observations really, and it follows on slightly from what the previous comrade was talking about corruption and mining the base, etc. And that is when you look at particularly Cuba and Venezuela, you look at the neighbourhood committees, and superficially they would seem to be institutions of an enhanced or expanded democracy, but in fact they operate on a completely top-down basis, and they are a means of imposing a discipline from the party down into the neighbourhoods, down through the activists, into people who may only be superficial supporters of the regime. They're just people trying to get on with their lives, as opposed to the base imposing a discipline on the structures at the top. But having said that, that's just an observation, and I think it's one that demonstrates to people from our own tradition that while there may be huge material advances for the people in those countries, when these regimes come to power, that they're not completely, or anyway, perhaps regimes that we would look to for inspiration in what we want to do here. But having said that, I was in Nicaragua twice in 1982, right at the beginning of the Contra War, and it is incredibly inspiring to be in a country where you have huge mass mobilizations that quite clearly aren't manipulated from the top. Where you walk down the street and there are huge billboards, okay, in a sort of Stalinist way perhaps, exhorting people to produce more and all the rest of it, but it's still, hasta la victoria siempre, everywhere, and it is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of points. The first is about the question that was raised about extractivism, because I think it's an important question. But you see, it's not just Bolivia and Venezuela. One of the interesting things about Brazil is that Brazil, which did have quite a big manufacturing base, has reduced that manufacturing base and has actually shifted back in the commodities boom towards low-level agricultural, mineral and low-level manufacturing outputs, largely directed towards China and other countries that are enjoying a boom. That process of extractivism, that process of the commodities super cycle has now ended. And unless the Chinese economy picks up in a massive way, I don't think we're going to return to that period. And I do think it has very important implications for the prospects for revolutionary struggle across the region. You see, if you look at the Venezuelan situation in particular, what you see between 2002 and 2005 is the most extraordinary process of repeated popular mobilisation. Largely popular mobilisation to prevent Chavez, but nonetheless popular mobilisation that pushes the regime in a more radical direction and which leads directly towards the introduction of these massive reforms. The reality is, though, in Venezuela, in periods of a high oil price, what you can do is simultaneously grant the wishes of the poor and satisfy the wishes of the rich. Because it's absolutely true that there are massive processes of reform in Venezuela. It's also true there's a massive process of enrichment of the ruling class in Venezuela. If you look at the growth of the public sector and public services in Venezuela, it doesn't come at the expense of the private sector. In fact, the private sector grows throughout this period as well. A boom in luxury car imports and all the rest of it. You see it You look at the images of Caracas and you see the super rich in Caracas. Those structures of class power weren't fundamentally challenged by this, and it creates a problem. Because it means even if you have people like Chavez within the state machinery, what you get around Chavez is the encroachment of all these people, the Bolivarian bourgeoisie that Andy talks about, who are deeply corrupt, who jump on the Chavez bandwagon, but have a completely different vision of where they're trying to take the process. You've always had in these processes two different souls. Chavismo from above or Chavismo from below. Now, I want to argue that if you look at the current situation in Latin America, without the advantages of the massive commodity bubble, the space for that kind of reformist strategy is much, much more limited. What you're going to see in Latin America today, I think, is much sharper contradictions, clashes between the ruling class and the people at the base of society. We have to hope that the best memories of that Bolivarian process, embedded inside the working class, are resurrected. But what people take from that is a dimension of popular power, struggle from below, and potential for revolutionary challenge, because what we want to see ultimately is not simply a diminution of capitalist power and some services for working class people. What we want to see is a more fundamental transfer of power from those at the top of society to those at the bottom.
Well, it didn't really transform the state, did it? It wasn't able to do that, and the dependence on the commodities meant that it was always going to be linked to world markets. So in some ways, they, Venezuelans and others, got rid of some of the influence of American imperialism and had to substitute it with Russian and Chinese imperialism instead. And so that basic relationship wasn't altered. And because that superstructure of the state was coexisting at the same time, it meant that when the oil price completely dropped, they weren't able to manage the subsidies, and so people now in Venezuela are queuing for food, medicines, and things like that. There's lots of violence and things in particularly the poorer barrios, and the support for that transmission belt, which was previously providing those goodies, is no longer there. But it shows that if you've got a regime which is at the top and trying to dole out in a fairer way the goods and wealth of society without actually tackling the motor, the generator of that wealth, and the diversification which should have been occurring, then if that's stopped, if that's destroyed by the fall in world commodity prices, the legitimacy of that regime is called into question, and ultimately begins to fail. I think there'll be echoes there. I mean, I went to Venezuela a couple of years ago and saw some of the houses that the missioners and things had managed to build. So there was a tangible and material uplift in people's lives for at that time. But equally, you could see that it was a very polarised society between the haves and the have-nots, and the Venezuelan ruling class were feeling fairly confident that they could crush it and get back into that situation.
It's a question really, because the basis of one of the bases of reformism in this country is the idea that the state is neutral, therefore you can work with it. To draw that conclusion in Latin America is kind of hard, given the background of Chile, the generals, and so on. But as I understand it, in Latin America, a key element is this idea that Latin American countries are victims of imperialism, and therefore we can unite as a people against the West and so on. And that gives an ideological background for the sort of class collaboration and working within the system as a people to operate in a reformist method. Could you expand that for you, or am I on the wrong track?
No.
Comrades, I want to ask a question, but can I explain why I want to ask it first? My experience of listening to debates about the pink tide and the progressive wonders of Latin America is hearing Stalinists, ex-Stalinists saying, you don't need to be revolutionaries, look at the wonderful progress that is being made in Latin America. Radical reformism is what we need, the world will be transformed. Well, the edge has gone off that tree. It went off a long time ago, but the Stalinists were slow. Question I've got, in our tradition, the tradition is about independent, highly democratic, you remember that? Tradition of the, Trotskyist movement. Question, and in Latin America generally, although it may be changing because of what's happening in Cuba, the tradition of radical intervention has been guerrillaism. And that's been, in many places, that's been a disaster in lots of areas. The question I've got is, what are the sources, if any, of our tradition of politics in Latin America, which would lead to the building of a movement that is radically reformist when the opportunity arises, but also is trying to build an independent workers' revolutionary cause, which will not, we hope, be subject to the weaknesses that have happened, that we had described.
I just want to reflect a bit on what Andy was saying about describing the Bolivarian process as one of a reformist process. Because the question arises, when does a reformist process become a revolutionary process? And of course we also describe revolutions often as part of a process rather than a single event. And it strikes me, and thinking about the sort of shock that almost went through the audience when you described Michael Roberts' programme, which was actually about the seizure of property. And it seems to me the question of the property relationship and the seizure of property does define that difference. And it was one thing that never really occurred in terms of a revolutionary process inside the Pink Tide. So if you look at the Chavista programme of the Misiones, essentially it was funded, as Andy says, by the profits of the oil industry and the other commodities from above. It was part of a state programme of reform. I'm looking also to the Argentinian process of the recovered factories. And if you look at the recovered factories movement in Argentina, of which there are about 250 factories were taken over by workers, the vast majority of these factories were taken over as the old owners abandoned them. They weren't actually a process in which we're slinging the bosses out. The bosses, in the vast majority, had already gone. So workers moved in and started opening up the factories. The situation then became one: whose property are these factories belonging to? Are they belonging to the workers, or are they still belonging to the old owner? And that posed the question to the Argentinian state. And what the Argentinian state responded to this property question was saying, well, in certain circumstances, the local authority can have an influence in controlling the factories. And actually, there was a reformist solution to the property question, which actually put a block, a barrier on workers actually controlling the means of production. And I think this property question is the one thing I think we have to be very clear about as not a failure, I think that's probably the wrong word, but a limitation of the Bolivarian process, and one thing which distinguishes us revolutionary socialists and our agenda for revolution from, if you like, some of the more Chavista programs that we've seen in Podemos and Syriza and so on and so forth.
Okay, we do have time for another question if anyone's got one, or I can ask Andy to come in and sum up. Okay.
Just a question really, why is it that Venezuela had such a high crime rate over the period that should be Chavez was in power? Even now, I think that I would normally associate that with right-wing regimes. Could Andy explain that?
Yeah, if you've got a few minutes, I'll question.
I did a meeting on it a couple of years ago, and it was a bit more hopeful then because you had Chavez and Morales in Bolivia. You had the water riots in Bolivia, so it was looking a lot more hopeful. So I did a quick skip round South America in about half an hour, like you tried to do. But one thing I focused on a bit more was what was happening in Argentina, because I don't know if you know, but the Argentinian economy collapsed. Virtually the dollar collapsed against their currency. So Argentina was reduced to sort of barter economy at the time. It's since recovered. But one thing that I noticed or focused on was the number of cooperatives that were forming. So I spent a lot of time on workers taking over factories and producing their own goods and forming cooperatives. And one guy who used to be the cleaner is now the managing director. This sort of stuff, sort of stuff that we really love. And since then I haven't heard an awful lot about it, because I should imagine since the recovery, the Argentinian economy's recovered, maybe is that thing still going on, or is it sort of now the capitalists are back in charge, they've got rid of it? So I just wondered what happened to these cooperatives in Argentina.
Okay, thanks everyone for the question. So I'll ask Andy to sum up if you can.
Right. This will be good, won't it? We could have a whole meeting on several of those different points, but let me try and go through them more or less as they came up, and then I'll try and sum up at the end. Let's start with the military. I'm going to cross these off. Let's start with the military. I mean, the kind of description you gave of the Latin American military is the dominant one. It's the, you remember from the early 70s, that picture of Chile, of Pinochet and all the generals lined up with dark glasses on all that, and is that chilling sort of image of the Latin American military. And it is the dominant one. Certainly it was in the 70s. At the same time, when I said that Chavez represented himself as part of a military reformist tradition, it's not very well known in Europe, but there is also a tradition in the military that is for example, national development, right? That does believe that you can use the state for progressive means and so on. So it's not kind of exclusive. The two examples I cited, Torrijos in Panama and Velasco Ibarra in Peru, did precisely that in the early 70s. And there is still, although there's an officer corps which is traditionally very right-wing, it comes from the posh families in whichever country, the middle of the officer corps, if you like, the middle cadre of the military often doesn't. It's often it's from the middle classes, it's educated through military academies in the same way as Chavez was. If you look at Chavez's career pattern, it's not uncommon in Latin American armies. So it's, the army isn't automatically on the side of the right, if you like. It can be swung left and right, as indeed Chavez did exactly that. Now, where are they at the moment? This is a guess, of course. It seems to me that at the moment, the Chavismo, the PSUV, retains the loyalty of the army. But I think there will be one of the major projects of the MUD, the right-wing opposition, to win the army over. Now, if anything, if there were to be major interventions to nationalise the bank sale or whatever, I think that the MUD would win over the army, and there would likely to be some sort of a military coup. I don't think the army want to do it in Venezuela, and I don't think they want to do it in many countries of Latin America. That kind of, not that ship has sailed, but this is not the moment where the army want to intervene in that way that they did in the early 70s in the Southern Cone, if you like. So I think it's unlikely, but not impossible, that the army will switch sides and simply mount a military coup. The truth is, they don't need to do it. They can mount a serious attack on all the gains of Chavismo through the National Assembly, up to and including, possibly, the reprivatisation of PDVSA, the Venezuelan National Oil Company. And I think that's the more likely path in terms of the military in Venezuela, at least. Corruption and the neighbourhood committees, it's strange really, isn't it, that we're talking so much about corruption now, and yet, particularly with Correa, but also, with Chavez as well, the attack on corruption was one of the major planks that animated the pink tide. If you look at, and they did some of it, they did clear out some of the old bureaucrats, etc. The problem is, as comrades have spoken about, that as long as you've got that state that still exists as an entity, in order to accumulate, to support and fuel the process of accumulation, you get new layers arriving into that state machine. And when people talked about I think they were called the comandos comunales or consejos comunales, the popular councils in Venezuela, they did have that facade of democracy, that there were participatory mechanisms from the bottom, and they were given a certain amount of control in a particular barrio or a particular area. However, they acted in three ways, actually. One was that notion of talking about resource allocation, etc. At a very, very basic level. It reminds me of the debate, do you remember the debate about participatory budgets in the Workers' Party in Brazil? Where essentially what you argue about is what you do with your little tranche of the cake. You don't argue about how many resources are available. The participatory budgets were recommended by the World Bank at one point as a way of engaging popular consent, if you like, as a model of consent in local government in Latin America. So they did exercise at very low level popular participation, but they did two things. One, you described, that idea of the transmission belt of instructions from top to bottom, and they did that. The other thing they did was co-opt a large number of opti at the base and move them away from the base into PSUV mechanisms and the lower levels of the Bolivarian state, if you like. And there's no doubt that's been done with a large amount of it. You described it in the Cuban Communist Party. There's no doubt it's been done in Venezuela as well. Mike Gonzalez, as you probably know, argues that the PSUV is very closely modelled on the structures of the Cuban Communist Party. And that did happen. And also, it's the bandwagon. You know, there was an access to corrupt positions. There was an access to, all right, it's probably pathetic at a certain, in absolute terms, but nonetheless, an access to control and resources that meant a position of power and a position of privilege. And it was very carefully used by the state bureaucrats. Let's try and talk about the comment from Germany who spoke about economic development. I don't know if you've read it, but the article on Brazil in ISJ this month is precisely talks about the brakes on economic development that the PT, the Workers' Party government in Brazil, has maintained. And Joe's right. I mean, it's not that it's static. It's gone backwards in Brazil. And it's undoubtedly true that without industrial diversification and the building of an industrial base, if you remain dependent upon extractive industries, especially if it's oil, but not only oil, iron ore in the case of Brazil, gas in Bolivia, petrol in oil in Ecuador, etc., then you cannot develop as a country which can be in any way self-sufficient or in any way allocate resources more equally within a society. And that's a major failing of Chavismo. They call it the Dutch disease, don't they? This reliance on one commodity all the time. And people are right. Because you could do it, you could get away with it at $140 a barrel. And it was neglected. The development of agriculture that Raphael referred to as well is worse still, actually. If anything, there is a higher dependence on imported food than there was. Now, even if you did diversify the economy, what has to go with that in any sort of socialist project or in any project moving towards it is a means of workers' control and workers' government of it, right? Which again, there were little sparks of it in Venezuela in the mid-noughties. You know, Alcasa, the aluminium company, I think was one of them. There were various examples that the left in Europe and North America held up as great beacons of it. The truth is they made very little impact on the economy. Very little impact on the economy, and they made even less impact on the politics. There was never any question of capitalist relations being challenged in Chavista Venezuela. Extractionism, I'm not going to go into. It's very interesting, both politically and economically, especially in Bolivia and Ecuador, I think. If you look at Ecuador, they genuinely tried at the beginning of the Correa government, they tried to restrict extractive industries in the Amazon in order to preserve the environment. And what they did was they offered to not work an oil field, I think it was, YTT, yeah? They offered to not work it if effectively capitalism would buy bonds that meant they didn't work it. Now, of course, unsurprisingly, this wasn't a great take-up from the international capitalist companies and so on. And they now have developed that field. The refinery Esmeraldas has been developed. They're pushing the oil industry very heavily. But the politics around it are very interesting. Again, no time for detail, but both Correa and the Morales government, especially Álvaro García Linera, who's the vice president in Bolivia, have made a very aggressive campaign against indigenous peoples, for example, who've tried to defend their land. The Tipnis dispute in Bolivia is detailed in an article in ISJ. There's a big debate in Ecuador about it as well. Correa's very aggressive about it. He accuses indigenous people of being corporatist. That's to say, they've got a little kind of enclave that they want to defend at the expense of the nation and, by implication, working people in other parts of the country. But it's a very difficult argument, I think, and a very complex one. But just to introduce it as a thing that people might want to look up, and so on. Where are we? Prestige projects, someone mentioned. Yeah. Rafael, wasn't it? He was talking about his prestige university, which is going to be the new Harvard or something in Latin America. Yeah, these things are nonsense, and they're a misappropriation of resources. If you want to know the best one, just pass me the game. Brazil. The best one, the most obvious one, is the World Cup in Brazil. It's absolutely scandalous. Just astoundingly, completely nakedly ridiculous. I think that Dance of the Devil is precisely about Brazil's involvement with the World Cup and its punitive and detrimental effects that it had on working class people. Getting there. Regionalism in Latin America, forgive me if I call it a region, when you were talking about the possibility of this kind of, because Latin America itself is a victim of imperialism, the political project is often couched in terms of we can all unite against the nasty North American devil at the top, and therefore we don't have those arguments within within our own countries. And essentially there is a national interest, and in Latin America the national interest is often perceived as a continental national interest, if you see what I mean, a Latin Americanism versus North Americanism or whatever. I think it's been the curse of Latin American politics for more than one generation. You know, when I was living in Ecuador, the only question was, are you an anti-imperialist? This is from the left. Are you an anti-imperialist? Is imperialism the main enemy? And you kind of go, well, yeah, imperialism is the main enemy, but what about your own ruling class? And they go, no, is imperialism the real enemy? And what this means is you end up with the most absolutely horrible right-wing gobshites who can persuade you that it's in your interest, and it's been the curse of Ecuadorian politics for decades. Less so, I think, in places like Bolivia, where there's a more mature working class tradition, and the same in Argentina and so on. But absolutely it is, and then somebody mentioned guerrillism as well, and the idea that somebody said the cutting edge of radical intervention has been guerrilla movements. I don't think that's necessarily true, actually. That's the case in some countries, but if you look at Argentina, for example, or Chile indeed, and certainly Brazil, that's not actually been particularly, we're talking 50 years ago now. So I think the movement away, that's pretty much, that ship has sailed. That's pretty much dead and buried, I think. It was very influential, and certainly its effect, in my opinion, was to take a large number of especially young militants out of the key working class movements and put them in ridiculous, no-win, in fact suicidal situations in the mountains, in Focus and this, that and the other. But I don't think it's particularly dominant tendency now. The sources of our tradition the basis for our tradition in Latin America are many. The Bolivian working class is astoundingly combative over decades and decades. So is the Argentinian working class. Read about the car strikes in Argentina in the 60s and 70s. Brazilian working class and the building of the Workers' Party, completely different now, by the way. The building of the Workers' Party. All these examples exist. They exist in the mines in Colombia. They exist in Venezuela to a large degree. Certainly they exist in Mexico. And we do, without apology, we do look to the question of the working class at the centre of it. Now, the Michael Roberts stuff about when does a reformist process become a revolutionary process? The comment he spoke is very good. It becomes a revolutionary process when you actually challenge capitalist power in society, which means you have to start doing things like expropriations. If you do not, it is not going beyond the bounds of a reformist position. If you do not have, if you don't have a process which actually, what Roberts says is it takes away the law of value. You can't follow the law of value in the political process and still be revolutionary. And he's right. But what that actually is saying is you've got to take profit out of capitalism. Well, that's not possible. It's got to be a frontal assault on the capitalist state and capitalist power. And that isn't really what the pink tide was about. I want to finish on a high. Oh no, I want to mention Maduro because I think it's a legit question. I have got absolutely no issue with Maduro as an individual. Right? I would love the Prime Minister of Britain to be an ex-bus driver. Hang on, isn't that Sadiq Khan? No, but you know what I mean. He's absolutely right that Maduro comes from the working class. When he became chair of the National Assembly, they have a bell in the National Assembly, and the joke was they were going to change the bell so it would go ding ding because it was a bus conductor. But he's a working class guy. He's come up from the bottom. He's been absolutely loyal to Chavez and to the process of change and to the interests of the working class. But I'm afraid it's not the point. you know. Always when you do meetings on Latin America in the SWP, you get slagged off for dissing our heroes, you know, everyone from Che Guevara down to Maduro and everybody in between. And it's right to a certain degree, because we are critical of people, because we you know, the point of being a Marxist is that you doubt everything, as Marx said. And you have got to look at the process of change from below. And however much I'd like to have a bus driver as a Prime Minister of Britain, it wouldn't matter if they were part of a capitalist state and a capitalist machine, which I'm afraid is what Maduro is, for all his no doubt good qualities as an individual. The trouble with doing this meeting is there's not much good news in it, is there? You know what I mean? So, I want to end on a kind of hopeful aspect, really. That, you know, also the sort of diversity of trying to do a meeting on Latin America is just bonkers. You know, how can you do a meeting on 25 countries? But it is a very, very important process. And it's an important process for all the reasons I've described in the talk. But I want to end just simply by saying this. Read about it, read the stuff. I mean, people have talked about various examples. You talked about Nicaragua and so on, but from way back when. But read the stuff about Cochabamba and what it was like to have an insurrection that took local power and beat the bosses. Read the stuff about El Alto, the slum across the top of La Paz is in a volcano. El Alto is across the top of it, hence it's called El Alto. It is astounding to look at the level of struggle, to look at the level of integration, to look at the role played by young people, to look at the role played by working class women in all those movements. There is an amazing amount of incredibly rich experience. And what it means is very simple, that there are those forces on the ground that can, you know, at the moment times are hard, without a doubt, it's no good news, or not much good news. But there is the basis for a real struggle, which does not simply take high price oil money and build houses and clinics, important though that is. Rather, it actually does start to challenge the citadels of capitalist power. That means at home as well in Latin America. So you challenge your own ruling class. You do try and unite those movements, and it's surprising in Latin America there's a much more kind of consciousness of the relationship between other countries in the region than there is in Europe, you know. But there is that basis for a genuine challenge to capitalist political relations, to capitalist economic relations, and the possibility of looking beyond the reformist limits of what we've described today and looking instead to a real tradition of revolution from below.